Okay, so I've got my computer here. As these notes get progressively longer, I'm going to have to probably rely on it more and more, so I apologize in advance for that. Again, we are here talking about this was the second one in a series of the Bible, and talking about the Bible and why it's important. And I think it's a really important thing for us to do, for us to say, as Christians or professing Christians, we are supposed to be basing our life on this book. And we can't pick and choose what we like and what we don't like. We're supposed to replicate our life off the life of Jesus, and we're supposed to use the Bible, which is, everything we need for teaching, correction, all this other stuff. So we need to know if it's true or not. And that's important because, as I've talked to a lot of people, one of the biggest things I hear is that the Bible is a myth. It's a bunch of good stories, it's fables, but it's not true. And I think that, and one of the things we're going to talk about today is not only that I believe that we can know with reasonable certainty that it is true, but it's important that we look at the historicity of the Bible. Is it historical? Because if it's not historical, then it might be fables. But if it is history, then just like we study history at school, we can look at the Bible and we can say, well, okay, this person really did exist, or this place really did exist, and so that increases the credibility of the Bible a lot. And so we if we know the Bible is true, and we can see that it is historical, that gives us a real foundation to base its teachings on. And I will start off to bust a lot of your bubbles. You cannot prove that the Bible is true. You can't. We just have to accept that. But on the positive side, nobody else can prove that it's not. So as we begin this journey, we have to just look at the evidence available. And I believe, as we're going to find out, that there's a lot of evidence that the Bible is history, and that's important. So the first thing we have to do when we look about the historicity of the Bible is, how is ancient history even determined? Because we've got guys like Aristotle, Homer, Plato, Julius Caesar, and a lot of these guys, they had writings, or the only thing we know about them is that's ancient history. And unless you have living eyewitnesses, how are you going to know if it's true or not? And a lot of times you're basing that on something, and what they're basing that on is ancient manuscripts. Aristotle had ancient writings, and we don't have the originals for these things. I mentioned that last week. We have copies. So one of the things that we look at when we talk about these documents is, how many copies do we have? And if we have copies, how close do they go back to the original? Obviously, the closer they go back to the original, the more likely it is to be accurate. We talked about last week how the translations, too many translations to be true, is not really true, and we're actually closer to the original of the Bible than we've ever been, the translation was. The same thing goes with history. If you could have eyewitnesses, that would be ideal. Well, we're talking about like thousands of years ago, so obviously there's no eyewitnesses. So the more manuscripts you have available, the more accurate of a picture you get. So you're looking at how many manuscripts do you have, and how close do they go back to the original, because nobody has the originals. And what I've found is that people almost, without even thinking, they disregard the Bible. They say, well, it's fake, it's a myth, whatever. And then on the other hand, they absolutely accept that everything we know about Julius Caesar, or about Aristotle, or about Plato and their writings is 100% historical, no questions asked. And what I'm going to show you is that that's not really, you can't really do that based on the evidence that's available. So for example, we have 5,000, at the time of this writing, there are 5,686 Greek copies or manuscripts of the Bible. Well, okay, that sounds like a lot. That's pretty good. And a lot of these go back to, some of them go back to as early as 100 years, or even 30 years, as we see. And for one of the copies of the Gospel of John, it goes 30 years from the time of the writing. Well, now in our days, we think, wow, 30 years, that's a long time. A lot can change in 30 years. But what we notice is that when the Bible was written, it was written before 100 AD. Jesus was thought to have died around 30 AD. So every single one of the books of the Bible in the New Testament was written before 100 AD. So again, that may sound like a long time to us, but in the scope of history and ancient history, that's not that long at all. And I'll talk about why. So we have all these manuscripts that go way back. So how does that compare to the other manuscripts? Well, if you look at the writings of Aristotle, and we have Plato and all those guys I mentioned earlier, we have copies of them, but we have like 10 copies or 15 copies, and the earliest known copy is 1,400 years after the original. So we're talking about the difference between 30 years and 1,400 years. We're talking about the difference between 6,000 documents and 10 documents. And yet we accept the 10 documents written 1,400 years as pure fact. It's ancient history, we know that. Well, and then for some reason we're looking at the Bible, which has 6,000 copies written only 30 years after the original, or found that were only 30 years after the original, and suddenly that's less historical. I don't think so. It doesn't really work like that. And if we just think logically, it would seem that the Bible would more likely be true, or historically speaking, it would be more likely to be true than would this writing that had 10 documents written that we found 1,400 years after the original. And again, the more copies that you have, the more you can compare with each other and find differences. And if you look at the Bible, all these Greek manuscripts, and actually if you talk about, it was first written in Greek, if you have Syrian, Latin, Coptic, and other things, if you combine all those copies, we have over 24,000. So you've got 24,010. Obviously, this one has more, it's more likely to be accurate. And if you compare all those 6,000 Greek documents, they, like we said last week, they have 99.5% accuracy, and even the small differere's, almost all of them are negligible. They don't even matter, maybe Jesus or Jesus Christ. The difference between one saying Jesus and one saying Jesus Christ. So there's a lot of reason to believe that it is the Bible is more accurate. Again, I mentioned that John, we've got one document dated back 29 years after the original. And why that's important about when these things, every single book of the Bible was written within 70 years of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection, is that there were a lot of people that were still alive when Jesus died and when he rose from the dead. There were a lot of people who were there. And so if the apostles had written saying this 20 years later, 20 years later they wrote this document saying, hey, this is what happened. There's plenty of people still alive that could say, no, that's not how it happened. And as a matter of fact, we know differently because we saw it too. And yet you find no historical documents that refute the claims of the Bible. There's almost no ancient historians who reject that Jesus actually did exist. He is a historical figure as much as anything else. There are some atheists who will claim that Jesus did not exist. Now, that's a really bold claim, because so much of ancient history, biblical copies and extra biblical, meaning non-biblical copies, reference Jesus, and so it's not really much of a debate whether Jesus really existed. Matter of fact, in a recent debate of Richard Dawkins, who's one of the most famous atheists, in the span of about 2 minutes, he said, okay, fine, Jesus did exist. We know that. Which in a book he actually wrote that he didn't. So one of the biggest things, another big thing that we look at is, apart from document numbers and accuracy and all that, is archaeological evidence. The Bible talks about places, it talks about people, it talks about events, and archaeology is pretty much the physical science of seeing historically whether those things actually happened. And there's not a single archaeological discovery that disproves anything that happened in the Bible. Nevertheless, many people used to think that the Bible had a lot of errors in it. They would say, in Luke 3:1, where it said Luke's account of Lysanias being the tetrarch of Abilene, a lot of people said, well, that's wrong, because he wasn't a tetrarch, Lysanias. He was just a ruler of Chalcis about 50 years earlier than what Luke described. So clearly that's a falsity. Or an error. But an archaeological inscription was found that said Lysanias was the tetrarch of Abilene near Damascus at the time that Luke said. There was just actually 2 people with the same name, and so things like that prove that Luke was in fact not wrong. They've also found the walls of Jericho destroyed just as the Bible said. Some people believe that Nazareth didn't exist, and they found evidence that did. They've also found evidence in tablets and different things that they discovered for Herod the Great, Herod Antipas. They found the Apostle Peter's house. The high priest Caiaphas, they actually found his bones in an ossuary, or like a thing that they used to store bones. They've actually found bones that at one point there was dispute whether crucifixion even really existed, and they found bones and skeletons with nail prints through the wrists and through the ankles, again proving that crucifixion actually existed. There's a lot of things that people have tried to throw out to disprove the Bible, and over and over and over again, archaeological evidence has shown that those things are historically accurate. They've also discovered places like Bethsaida, Bethany, Caesarea Philippi, Capernaum, Cyprus, Galatia, Philippi, Thessalonica, Athens, Ephesus, a lot of those places where Paul wrote books to, or letters to. So archaeologically and historically with the manuscripts, we see that the Bible is most likely, based on evidence available, to be true. It's more likely to be true. So if you've got these people who are going to accept Plato, Aristotle, and they're going to accept Caesar, Homer, which these things are generally accepted, as I mentioned. If we're going to believe those things based on the evidence available, we have to believe that the Bible is more likely to be historical. Again, you can't prove it either way, but you can base it on evidence. And I think that the Bible has passed that test, at least in my own personal studies, and has substantially superior criteria for affirming that the New Testament documents are in fact historical. And that's a good evidence that we have to trust the Bible. Not necessarily, we'll talk about later how it's actually inspired by God. This doesn't show that, but what it does show is that the Bible is historically accurate. And that's important, and that's a huge step. Again, if you have more questions about this, I would suggest going to www.carm.org, and you can look, and there's a lot of questions. I think there's a tab on the left that says Bible, and you can look at that, and it explains a lot of that stuff. So I hope that was helpful.